Hello. Goddamn coffee maker. Anyway, it's been quite a while since I've done a video. How does this go? Here? Oh no, the other way around. It's been quite a while since I've done a video, and it's because I haven't had anything to say, to tell you the truth. Because we're in this very weird spot in this global conflict. This global conflict, which is, of course, all about the United States' slipping position as the undisputed global hegemon. These are basically the death throes of the global hegemon that was the United States. And what's emerging, of course, is a multipolar world. And this is something that the American leadership, a very specific subgroup of the American leadership, cannot stomach. And so we're going through this world war, because it is a global war. It's a world war. This is World War III that we're in. It might not seem like it. You might think that World War III was all about, supposed to be about, missiles flying at one another and cities blowing up. And you didn't think that it was going to be like this kind of situation where it's like, we have this, rinky-dink little war in Ukraine with proxies and all kinds of political moves and whatnot, but no clashing armies, right? Well, we're in this weird period of prelude in this global war. And it remains to be seen how big the whole thing gets. Back in 1939, was it? Yeah, the British came up with a saying. They called it the phony war. The war between the Brits and the Germans. They called it the phony war because they had mutually declared war on one another, but nothing much was happening, right? Well, something similar is happening now. The Germans called it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war, which I think is actually more appropriate because it was a war. Phony war implies that it's not a war, but it was a war, but you're just waiting around, right? So now I would argue that we're in another Sitzkrieg. The war is on. It's been all but declared, but we're kind of like waiting around. And right now, what we're waiting around for is the mopping up of Ukraine. Because, see, it's an indisputed fact that the Russians here, let me just fix the camera here just a little bit. It's undisputed fact that the Russians have pretty much won the war here. I think it's an absolute catastrophe, a disaster by any metric that you can think of. But the Russians have won, and we are currently in a policing operation. This is no longer a war. This is a police action. A police action in the sense that, see, order will be restored. And there is one undisputed authority. And the end result of all of this fighting and conflict, it's inevitable. There's no longer there's no doubt about the outcome. And it's going to be a tragedy for the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation, which will, how can I put this gently? The old Ukraine will never exist again. It's gone forever, okay? And it's an absolute tragedy. And big pieces of Ukraine will go to Russia, and what remains of Ukraine will be a rump state. It will be a trivial nation, like any of those other Eastern European statelets that are, I mean no disrespect, but it's just the practical reality of these small countries that, for all of their lovely people and beautiful everything, they're trivial because they're small, see? And that's what's going to happen to Ukraine. Ukraine will be a rump state, and it will be trivial. And because so many of the best and the brightest people of Ukraine have fled and have established lives for themselves in Western Europe, well, not many will actually return to this rump Ukraine state. So it will always be poor. It will always be, the ugly stepchild. That's a fact. And it might well become a part of the European Union. I don't think so. I think that the rump Ukraine state will be controlled by some puppet regime, controlled by Russia. But that's not important. The point of this video that I want to make here is that, see, we're in this weird waiting around period. And the key issue is, see, the Americans have to figure out if they really want to go to war, to kinetic war, with anybody. Because, you see, they're desperate to go to war with somebody, okay? I mean, they have this huge army, the biggest army, the most powerful military force on the planet, right? But what has happened is that over the past 4 months, what is it? February, March, April, May, June, 4 months. Over the past 4 months, they've got a good look at what the Russian military has on offer. And the Americans have concluded correctly that they don't have what it takes to have a war with the Russians. They can't fight the Russians because they'll lose. And they'll lose catastrophically. Well, that's a fact. And insofar as China is concerned, the American military is probably realizing that its great weapon, its aircraft carrier battle groups, well, they are fantastic for small and medium-sized countries. Fantastic for those. They scare the bejesus out of a small country or a medium-sized country. A country like, like Iran, for instance. Iran is a great power, but it's a medium-sized power. It's not a great power. You know what I'm saying? And so for those kind of middling and smaller countries, an aircraft carrier battle group is fantastic. But for a peer country, a peer power, or a near peer power, militarily speaking, they're a huge vulnerability. Yeah, because the peers at this time are the Russians and the Chinese, and they both have hypersonic weapons that, as a practical matter, will get through. If you send a swarm of these missiles, of these hypersonic missiles, you send 20. If you have, just a 15% rate of actually hitting the target, the other 85% of these missiles get blown up by missile defense forces and air defense forces and whatnot, right? But only 15% get through. Those 15% of 20 missiles, 3 missiles, that'll sink an aircraft carrier. It will. And an aircraft carrier has, I think it's 4,000 or 6,000 military personnel. The Americans politically cannot handle such a loss. And more importantly, and what's really interesting, is that the Americans are realizing that industrially, they can't compete. And this has them completely freaked out. Yeah, because what happens is that, last week, or we're coming up on 2 weeks now, there's a guy called Alex Vershinin, as I understand it. He wrote here, I have it right here in front of me, in the Royal United Services Institute website. The RUSI is like a big old think tank that the Brits have. He called it The Return of Industrial Warfare. And the upshot of the very, very influential article that everybody read, everybody who cares about this kind of stuff read, is that basically the West does not have the industrial capacity to match the Russians. This is something that I thought of before the start of this war. Before this war, I thought if there's ever a great power war, the tempo of combat, the speed and relentlessness of it is going to be never before seen in human history. And this has proven to be true. The Russians, it's 24/7 with them. They're on the clock all day long. Missiles, attacks, everything. It's relentless. It's real industrial warfare, right? I mean, if the first time we had industrial warfare was the U.S. Civil War, and then the next big step was the First World War, and then the Second World War. Well, here we are in the Third World War, and this is relentless. This does not stop. And the Americans simply don't have what it takes to fight the Russians. And this is what Alex Vershinin is basically saying. The West does not have the industrial base to replace all the artillery, the missiles, all this stuff. And also what's happened is that, see, the Russians have done a lot of little things that have gotten more bang for the buck. I've said many, many times the story of how the Russians came up with a zero-gravity pen. It was a problem that NASA had, that they needed a zero-gravity pen. So NASA spent $1 million to develop a zero-gravity pen. And you know what the Russians did? They started using pencils. The Russians have a military budget that annually is
about 1/15 the size of the Americans. Yeah, it's roughly 7% of the Americans' annual budget. Yeah. What is it? Yeah, because the Americans have 800 billion a year, and the Russians have like 65 billion. Yeah. Less than 10%. It's about 8%, 7%, something like that. Yeah. And well, the thing is, see, the Russians save money. They get more bang for the buck. And this very interesting article by Alex Vershinin basically pointed out that if the U.S. were to go to war, if NATO were to go to war, the tempo of weapons being used on the battlefield, I mean, looking at the Ukraine conflict now, it proves that the U.S. would not last more than, 8 weeks or something. They wouldn't have the material to go the distance. And they don't have the factories to replace the stuff that they've got. And there was one weapon system, I forget which one, it doesn't really matter, it's a detail, but you can find it in the article, that they were saying how, the Russians were chewing through one kind of weapon at a rate that was like 3 times the annual rate of the American production line. And there were some weapon systems like the Javelin, for instance, the anti-tank weapon that hadn't been manufactured in years. The technology was probably even lost to rebuild this stuff. That happens, by the way, that you lose technology, that the people who knew how to do it retire and just die off or phase out or whatever. I mean, that kind of things happens all the time. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the West has realized they don't have what it takes to go up against the Russians. If they go up against the Chinese, they have a huge vulnerability with their aircraft carriers. And so if they go up against the Russians or the Chinese, it's likely that they will suffer a catastrophic defeat. And they can't handle that. And so what are they going to do? And so right now, there are some sensible people in the West who are arguing for negotiations in Ukraine and try to rebuild some status quo with the Russians, which is going to prove impossible as far as I'm concerned. And the Russians now hate the Europeans, and more importantly, they don't trust them, okay? And so they're never going to do business with the West ever again. And so Europe is going to go cold this winter. That's in the cards, man. Okay, but anyway, there's that one segment that wants to negotiate and the other segment that wants to double down. There's this general yesterday, some British general who looked all tough, one of those typical like central casting type generals, right? And he's just a blowhard, he's full of shit, right? And he's saying that, no, we're going to have to rebuild the British army so we can go back and fight them Ruskies because that's what's going to happen. We have to fight the Ruskies, right? Yeah, it's pathetic. But anyway, there are a lot of those types of people. And those types of people in Washington, in London and whatnot, they're the ones who have been pushing the Lithuanians into goading the Russians. They're the ones who are, getting these meetings together with Arab leaders to see how they can go to war with Iran. They're the ones who have this itch that they need to scratch. Yeah? And see, if the itch were all about pussy, well, that'd be fine. But it's about going to war, man. I mean, come on. And I'm laughing because if I weren't laughing, I'd be screaming in horror. And I'm not kidding. Because this is horrifying. These madmen, they are so hell-bent on war that they are trying to figure out, well, if we can't fight the Russians because we don't have the industrial capacity, and we can't find the Chinese because we'll lose our aircraft carriers, who do we fight? That's the attitude of a madman. And that's who's leading the United States. And I'm not fucking kidding here. This is serious business. And so right now we're in this Sitzkrieg. We're waiting around. We're waiting around to see what happens. See? Because, okay, let's go through the numbers. We see the Russians in the Donbass. They're winning. They're going to take over the whole goddamn country. After that, what happens then? Well, nobody can really predict because there are so many variables. And this is true. They're just, the Russians, how are they going to do? When's going to be the moment of capitulation of the Zelensky regime? Because the Zelensky regime is not capitulating because the West doesn't allow it. Boris Johnson calls him on the regular to tell Zelensky, keep on fighting, the British fighting spirit. Yes, you have this thing, even though you're, a Jewish Ukrainian guy, but you are British. Fight on! You shall fight on the land and the beaches and the blah, 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 and all this bullshit. Churchillian nonsense, right? So Boris Johnson is pushing Zelensky to keep on fighting. And there's nothing to be won for Ukraine. The longer this goes on, the worse the negotiating position for the Ukrainians, for the Zelensky regime. The more territory they're going to have to give up. And if they keep on resisting the unstoppable Russian advance, and you can say a lot of things about the Russians, right? But one thing, they are fucking good at war. I mean, no kidding around. They know what they're doing when they go to war. And this is proving it, okay? And so every day that passes, it's going to be worse for the Zelensky regime. It's going to be worse for the Ukrainian nation. They're going to wind up giving up more and more territory. They're going to wind up giving away the whole circus at the pace that they're going. And that's what one segment of the West wants. They want to continue to fight to the last Ukrainian man, woman, or child. And the more sensible Europeans want a negotiated settlement as quickly as possible because they see the tidal wave that's going to hit Europe, economic, social tidal wave that's going to hit Europe come the winter. I've said this before. It's going to be the migrants in Europe, the people who are new arrivals and first-generation migrants, who are going to be the biggest social problem in Western Europe. They're the ones who are going to riot. It's not going to be the defeated, exhausted, ethnically native Germans and French. Those people, man, they lost their spirit. They lost their manhood. They are inconsequential. What matters now are the immigrants in Europe, those millions of immigrants who are not going to put up with going cold in the winter. And they're going to riot, and they're going to cause all kinds of social disturbances. That's why you see, like Germany, for instance, starting to squeeze everything down, going after journalists, like they went after this young woman, Alina, I forget her name. But she's reporting on the Donbass. They're threatening her with 3 years in jail for reporting the truth. What the hell is that all about? But of course, it's the German government putting on the screws on their own society because they're smart enough to realize what's going to happen. And what's going to happen is that you're going to have mass riots come the fall and the winter. And so they want to lock everything down before that happens. And at the same time, of course, pleading with Zelensky to negotiate so they can open a route to the Russians to get the gas and the food back to Europe, right? And so you have these competing powers, escalation, negotiation. And so that's why we're in the sitting war. That's why nothing much is happening. That's why it's kind of like pointless for me to be doing videos. Because nothing much is happening. It's all very predictable. And talking about the minutiae of this town got taken or that town got taken, there are better people than me, man. I mean, come on. There's a Military Summary channel. He's a great guy. Dima is fantastic. I urge you to go check him out. Military Summary. That's the name of his channel on YouTube. And he's fantastic. And he gives us these daily briefings, and they're all so detailed with the maps and all this good shit. And says the Russians advanced here, and they took this town there, and there's fire controlled over this road, and blah, 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 and all this really interesting minutia that I could give a rat's ass, man. I'm never going to report on any of that shit. But you see the point. Everything that Dima is saying in Military Summary, it's basically the Russians took this, the Russians took that, because it's over. The war here is fucking over. The sooner people realize this, the sooner they can lift their heads up and look around and realize what's really going on, the real battle of this Third World War, which is this seesaw, this teeter-totter between more escalations, more sanctions, more war with somebody, anybody. I mean, let's fight Iran if need be. I mean, that's what these crazy people are thinking. Or negotiation, peace, a settlement, a new status quo. But the problem is that the Americans cannot allow that. They cannot. They cannot allow that to happen because the Americans, or at least a subgroup of the American leadership class, understands that right now they are in an existential crisis. This is for all the marbles. Because if the United States doesn't somehow come up on top, in their estimation, then the United States will cease to be the global hegemon. It will be just another great power among three. And these people, because of their ego, cannot stomach that. And that's why more people are going to die. Sucks, man. What can I say?